serve and are serving today. Would those who are able please rise for posting of the colors by the Truman State University ROTC Honor Guard and the playing of the national anthem by the Kirksville R3 Symphonic Band. Please rise.
Forward, march, left, 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 right, 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 left, 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 right, 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 left, 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 right, 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 left, guard, halt, right.
celebrities that have enriched this nation, making it unique in the world community. And whereas the Dare County Veterans Organizations are calling for all individuals to remember those who have given of themselves in defense of freedom, and to honor those men and women of our armed forces who have served and are serving today.
Richard is a 1988 Kirksville High School graduate and a 1996 Southeast Missouri State graduate. Corey earned his Master's of Business Administration from Webster. He was the first student out of flight school to be selected to train and to fly the Super Hornet, and made the first combat deployment of the Super Hornet from the aircraft carrier USS Abraham
It's an
Lincoln.
honor to be here with you on Veterans Day. It's always a pleasure to be back in Kirksville. I can honestly say that I spent much of my childhood trying to figure out how to get out of Kirksville, and the whole rest of my adulthood, if you will, trying to figure out how to get back. For me, my passion for flying and my path towards becoming a naval aviator and officer all began here in Kirksville. When my parents moved us out from in town, out to the family farm just south of town. It didn't take me long to discover that the rock road leading away from our house was only a short bike ride over to the Kirksville airport. And as I grew up, my trips to the airport became more frequent, and my fascination with flying and eventually military aviation began to kick in. My senior year in high school, I finally started taking flying lessons and eventually earning my private pilot's license here at the airport. Years later, definitely surreal for me, as I was not only blessed with the opportunity to become a naval officer, but also an invitation to go get selected for flight school, and later on getting selected to attend the Top Gun course myself. The difference between Top Gun the movie and Top Gun the class going through. I remember we were in week 2 or 3, a close friend of mine who I was going through the Top Gun course with and I were studying. And I remember looking at him and going, man, we've been here almost 3 weeks. I haven't seen anybody playing volleyball on the beach. Nobody's been partying in the club, singing to girls. You know, we'd spent all our time. The only accurate thing about the movie was getting our butt kicked by all the instructors. And we spent the things that I went into the Navy with that I considered rites of passage. I think those are, first of all, getting carrier qualified, but then night qualification, pitching deck at night, 0-0 landings when somebody's talking you down to where you have about 2 seconds of being able to see the deck before you touch down. All things that I thought of rites of passage. And one of them was honestly going into combat, but not only that, the guys teaching us were Vietnam guys, Desert Storm guys, all those guys had been shot at, all those guys had seen aggressive combat. And so that was my final one. I say, you know, I know I'll made it when I've been shot at in combat. You know, so Iraq War starts, end of my first deployment, and we're in week 1 where most of the heavy fighting is going on. And all my buddies are getting shot at, you know. That two first couple days, I was daytime most of the time and couldn't see most of the fire if there was any, and I assume there was. Because on my 3rd day, went out at night, and all of a sudden, all of Baghdad's shooting at me, you know, 3 missiles at a shot, you name it, probably 40 plus that I could see on my MVGs just on that flight. And within about the 3rd missile coming at me, I decided that my goal of getting a chance to get shot at was probably stupid. And in the future, I should probably come up with goals that don't involve trying to get myself killed. So, as I grew up here in Kirksville, we're a bit a day that often was filled with my dad and I watching our favorite movies, documentaries. Patton, A Bridge Too Far, Big Red One, just to name a few. And then followed as I got older by a lot of the Vietnam era movies and documentaries. Although my parents had not served directly in the military, both my grandfathers had served in World War II in various capacities, serving both in the Army and the Navy. But still, their specific details of service were not openly discussed. And for my wife, Karen, her father, Don, who's with us here today, served during Vietnam, but Veterans Day was still not one that necessarily stood out in her mind when she was younger either. Joining the Navy straight out of college, my focus honestly was initially all about flying, and the hope of eventually earning a spot flying fighters off carriers if I could do it. A few years later, as I transitioned into a fleet squadron, the focus for both Karen and I transitioned over to not just the flying, but more importantly, the quality of the people that we were serving with. Over time, the sense of sacrifice began to sink in, as we had multiple long overseas combat deployments and occasional loss of friends and colleagues due to either training accidents or combat action. And now, a little over 21 years of service completed and 4 years of being retired, Karen and I have developed a passion for veterans and the sacrifices they've made. And with 2 boys, Trevor's with us today, a junior in high school, and Lucas, who's off in college, we have made it a priority to ensure they have a better perspective of Veterans Day than we did at their age, and a continued connection with veterans from both past and current conflicts. Just up the road from where Georgia lived was the local mechanic, Roy Frazier, who was a mechanic for out at the airport. And his wife, Mary, was there as well. And if any of you ever knew them, Roy was completely deaf at this point by the 70s and 80s from an entire lifetime of working on airplanes and being around aviation. And his wife did all of his work for him. He was the nicest guy on the planet, but couldn't talk on the phone, so she did all of the work. Over the time, Roy figured out that I was riding my bike back and forth to the airport. So he started on weekends and summer days. He would come down to the farm and bring his red truck, throw my bicycle in the back of it, and take me to the airport with him so I didn't have to ride. And I'd spend the day out there climbing all over the airplanes he was working on, looking at all the engines, watching all the airplanes take off and land. In the coming years, I figured out that Roy's son, Alan, was a McDonnell Douglas experimental test pilot and a Rieger Guard pilot, and that was really my introduction to military aviation, and that real people that now I knew did that sort of thing that I had always dreamed of. It was about the time, it wasn't really until the time of Roy's death that I realized he also served in the military during World War II. He served in the 49th Service Squadron in the 5th Air Force in the Pacific Theater as a mechanic, operating from island bases all the way from Leyte in 1943, all the way to Okinawa in 1945. A gentleman by the name of Wallace Dottie. I don't know if anybody here knew Wally or not, but turns out he was a Marine Corps fighter pilot flying F-4U Corsairs throughout the Pacific. When he came over, he brought flight maps and charts that he still had. He still had all of his gear from World War II, and he brought most of that with him. He had a brother who had become a POW with the Japanese on an island somewhere out there, and they were in a prison camp. And at some point, his squadron got tasked with bombing the same prison camp. And they had intel that told them when they thought the prisoners were being taken out for work or things of that nature. But you never know, intel still today isn't that great, and back then it definitely wasn't. So they planned their mission, did the best they could to try to miss the time period they thought he would be in the prison camp, and went out and bombed the prison his brother was in. And it wasn't until later on that he found out that they were in fact out in the fields, and no kidding that his brother had survived. Typically between surface-to-air fire and enemy aircraft coming up at them, they'd all get dispersed. And once they got low on gas or out of ammunition and bombs, they would start heading back, typically as a single a lot of times, and just try to pick up a wingman of opportunity. So he's headed back one time, finds another aircraft, joins up on him so they can provide each other support, and realizes the aircraft has pretty heavy damage. And then when he gets really close, he realizes not only the aircraft damage, but the pilot had taken a round through the cockpit, through the eye. His left eye was gone. So he signals him, knows about an outlying field on an island out near them, guides the guy over, helps him land, lands behind him, taxis up next to him and shuts down, gets out, pulls this injured guy out of his cockpit, rolls his own seat all the way down, sits him in his own seat, climbs on top of him and sits on his lap, and he flies him back to base. Pretty impressive. So he had owned and operated Wally's House of Beauty. I mean, the last place on earth a teenage boy would ever want to go is a beauty parlor in town. And lo and behold, a badass Marine Corps fighter pilot happened to be owning and running that place the entire time. So I'll tell you, over the years, these and other chance meetings have made me more appreciative of the fact that we have veterans all around us that we probably aren't aware of, or maybe we are aware of them, but we take for granted the experiences they may have to tell. I think not taking these things for granted is even more important when we live in a close-knit, small community like this one. And although we've lost most probably of our World War II and Korea War veterans, or close to it at this point, There are still folks out there that have served since then, definitely Vietnam and current conflicts, that we can get a hold of. Although I'm sure you know more people than I do in this area, it's all up to us to make sure that we find these folks and we talk to them and we preserve those stories before they're lost. In the end, I'd like to thank all the veterans out there for coming, and I want you to all have a great Veterans Day, and thanks again for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Board, Mark.